Lord, we look to you for help. And so in this time, I pray that your Spirit would help my words and my thoughts bring understanding, that they would bring you glory and honor. In Jesus' name, amen. When have you been tempted to give up? When have you gotten so discouraged that you just weren't sure you could keep going? Has there been a time when you nearly gave up hope? When you lost faith that there would ever be a way out of a tough situation? The question in the scripture passage that has been ringing in my ears all week long is the one at the very end. When the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? We're often tempted to view struggle as an indicator of weakness in faith. But what if struggle is part of the very nature of our faith in God? The disciples had asked Jesus, increase our faith. And last week, we considered how faith grows in the soil of gratitude. A sign of faith is a deep thankfulness to God in our hearts. But just so we don't mistake this thankfulness as only coming out of a response to God's goodness, this week, Luke points us to another sign of faith: persistence. Persistence in prayer, persistence in seeking justice, persistent faith. The widow in the story is the one that the story that Jesus is telling is a person who has struggled and is continuing to struggle. She has lost her husband, and at that time, it was so much more than just losing a loved one. It was the loss of the source of her security and her livelihood. In this scenario, the woman goes directly to the judge. And it doesn't sound so strange to us today, but in that time when Jesus told that story, it would have been very surprising that this widow went directly to the judge. Because no woman, and particularly no widow, would have been going to the judge on her own. Some other family member, a son, a grandson, a father, a brother, a male cousin, someone else would have been going to the judge on her behalf. And so this woman must have suffered compounded losses. Losses that meant that there were no children or family members around her. And instead of being represented, the woman herself is the one who is banging on the judge's door, who's calling out to him as he comes and goes from his judge's chambers. She's begging to be heard, begging for justice. She is bold and she is persistent. And the judge, Jesus paints him in pretty harsh terms. A person who doesn't care a whit about God and even less about what other people think. He was a corrupt judge, a self-serving judge, not interested in real justice. The widow didn't stand a chance. And yet going through him was her only path to getting what she deserved or what she needed. Her only hope for getting out of a desperate and discouraging situation. And so she persists. And Jesus asks, do you hear what that judge, corrupt as he is saying? If a corrupt judge will relent and do what is right, how much more a caring and compassionate God? Jesus then also asks, so what makes you think that God won't step in and work justice for people who continue to cry out? Won't God stick up for them? I assure you he will, Jesus says, and he will not drag his feet. Faith is like a woman who is willing to defy the social restrictions that seek to press her down and silence her, and is willing to speak out against a corrupt and broken system that's denying her what she needs. She persists in going to the judge, an image of how we should persist in going to God in prayer. But when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? That mission video that we just watched about the miracle in Jiquilpan, Cuba, has a story of deep struggle behind it. Baptist mission work in Cuba actually began in 1898. American Baptist churches and Southern Baptist churches collaborated together to send missionaries to Cuba, and during the first half of the 20th century, churches were planted, and schools and hospitals and medical mission work were begun. That lasted for 60 years, until in 1959, Fidel Castro led the Cuban Revolution, which instituted communist rule and closed the country to Christian workers. Missionaries had to leave quickly. Those that were stayed were detained and imprisoned, and they were even sent to labor camps. The government declared itself atheist, prohibited worship, and the church buildings were forced to close as the government seized their properties. In this past year or so, as the relationships between the U.S. and Cuba has been restored and there's a new openness dawning, we have discovered what happened in those intervening years when all we knew was silence. We've learned that during that time of repression and suffering, that the believers persistently cried out to God in prayer and quietly shared their faith in Jesus with their families and their friends. So with the fall of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, what had been for them lives of austerity and simplicity became lives of real suffering, because the support from the economic support from the Soviet Union ended. There were severe food shortages. There were shortages of all sorts of resources. And yet, amazingly, the Baptists in Cuba look back at this time, and as the man in the video said, they call it a special time. It was special because the number of believers began to grow. And in the late 1990s, the Christian leaders decided to approach the Castro government and ask for permission to rebuild their churches and to begin to meet together again for worship and prayer. The answer from the government came back, "What is it with you Christians and your buildings? Can't you pray in houses?" And so they did. They did pray in houses. And that is what brought some of this growth. They began to come together for prayer. As the video said, a small group of 7 people that met in a house in Jiquilpan is now a house church of more than 300 people. That house church sponsors youth groups and evangelism events and a marriage ministry, and that church has even planted 2 more house churches. When the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? Jesus is the one who asked that question, and yet he was the Son of Man himself. And he was preparing to show his disciples in his own life the nature of faith and struggle. Jesus teaches them to pray for daily bread and not to worry about tomorrow. He models for them times devoted to prayer. Jesus cautions a would-be follower that the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. Jesus faced the constant badgering and challenge of the religious leaders and teachers of his time. They tried to shame him, discredit him, and ridicule him. He had struggle. One of Jesus' disciples, one of those inner circle guys, betrays him. He greets him with a kiss and hands him over to be arrested. Judas sells Jesus for a few coins. He had struggle. Jesus is falsely accused on trumped-up charges. Corrupt judges condemn him. Jesus is stripped and whipped and nailed to a cross. And the struggle of that day, the suffering of that day, is almost unimaginable to us. Nails pounded into his wrists and his ankles, struggling for each breath. He watches the grief of his mother and his beloved friends. The suffering of Jesus as a man, as a human being, astounds us. But Jesus was not just a human being entering into this struggle to show us God's love. He was God himself entering into this world of struggle and taking on the pain around him. God didn't just stand back and watch the struggle of life. God stepped right into it. As it says in Hebrews 4, we don't have a God who is out of touch with reality. He has been through weakness and testing, experienced it all except the sin. We have a God who has entered into the very experience of our pain and our suffering, and who understands us fully. So when we think back to difficult times in our lives, to times of struggle, or maybe we look ahead and we're trying to prepare ourselves for difficulties that we see might be coming, or maybe if you're in a time that seems dark right now, I want to emphasize two things that you can hold on to. The first is that God is present with us in the struggle. We don't struggle alone. We don't wrestle with unfair situations or painful circumstances or discouraging setbacks by ourselves. God has already walked on that road. God is walking ahead of us, and God is right beside us, closer than our own breath. In Bible study on Wednesday, we were reading Psalm 22, which Jesus holds onto as a prayer in the midst of that most difficult day of suffering. And his prayer begins, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Jesus